In the unforgiving winter of 1888, the American West was a land of brutal truths. For a man left for dead justice was a ghost, and survival a fading ember. What happens when your hunt for a demon leads you into the jaws of a blizzard, broken and bleeding? What happens when you're dragged by your own horse, your life measured in frozen heartbeats? And what happens when your only chance for salvation lies with a pregnant stranger, isolated in the wilderness, who must decide if saving you is worth risking the last fire she has to stay alive? This isn't just a story of survival. It's the story of how two broken souls hunted by the same monster found their humanity in the heart of an icy hell. The wind had a voice, and it spoke of damnation. It wasn't the lyrical whisper that teased the summer aspens of the Colorado Rockies. This was a screeching, scouring banshee born in the frozen peaks and unleashed upon the Gunnison country with primordial fury. It ripped and tore at the very fabric of the world, peeling the bark from ancient pines and turning the air into a maelstrom of blinding white. And through it, Lucas Stone was dying. He wasn't dying nobly. There was no final stand, no blaze of glory befitting a man who had once worn the star of a U.S. Marshal. He was dying stupidly, ignominiously, tethered to his panicked horse, Diablo, by a freak accident of rope and stirrup. His left boot was cinched tight, his body a macabre pendulum thudding against the frozen earth and unseen obstacles buried beneath the snow. Pain was a distant country he'd left miles ago. Now there was only a symphony of violent sensations, the jarring crack as his ribs struck a submerged log, the searing scrape of his cheek against ice-crusted granite, the rhythmic, sickening lurch as Diablo, a powerful bay he had trusted for 5 years, fought against the storm that had stolen his senses. Every instinct screamed at Lucas to free himself, but his arms were numb, his fingers clumsy claws of ice inside his leather gloves. His world was a confusing blur of white snow, dark horseflesh, and the crimson smear he was painting across the landscape. Just that morning, the sky had been a crisp, crystalline blue. He'd been tracking Silas Kane. The name was a prayer and a curse on his lips. Silas Kane, the vulture of the Rio Grande, a man whose cruelty was a legend, whispered from dusty cantinas in Chihuahua to the gilded saloons of Denver. Kane wasn't a common outlaw who robbed stages for coin. He dealt in misery. He trafficked in people, in fear, in the slow, agonizing destruction of everything good. And he had destroyed Lucas's world. A year ago in the dusty town of Trinidad, Deputy Marshal Elias Rowe, Lucas's partner and friend since they were boys chasing rabbits in the Ozarks, had cornered Kane. Elias was the better shot, the quicker thinker. But Lucas was the senior marshal, and he'd made the call to wait for backup. A cautious, by-the-book call. Kane hadn't waited. He'd emerged from the livery stable, not with his hands up, but with a woman, a baker's wife named Mrs. Gable, as a shield. Her terrified eyes had met Lucas's for a fraction of a second. Elias, ever impulsive, ever noble, had tried to flank them. A single booming shot from Kane's Colt had echoed through the street. Elias had fallen, the dust turning dark around him. Kane had vanished, leaving Lucas with nothing but the echo of the gunshot and the weight of a decision that had cost his friend's life. He'd turned in his star the next day, the silver star, feeling like a brand of shame on his chest. The Pinkertons couldn't find Kane. The bounty hunters lost his trail. But Lucas couldn't lose the image of Elias's face or the promise he'd made to his friend's widow, Martha. he would find Silas Kane. He would drag him back to Trinidad, not to hang, but to stand trial where Elias had fallen. It was a penance, a pilgrimage. The trail had led him deep into the Rockies to a rumor of a high country hideout where Kane was allegedly meeting associates to plan a raid on the silver shipments from the Molly Kathleen mine. For 3 days, Lucas had pushed himself and Diablo fueled by stale biscuits and a cold, burning rage. He'd ignored the signs, the unusual stillness of the forest, the strange, bruised color of the afternoon sky, the warnings of an old Ute trapper he'd passed, who simply pointed to the peaks and said, "The White Death comes." Lucas, blinded by his quest, had dismissed it as mountain superstition. The blizzard had descended not like a weather front, but like a judgment. One moment he could see the distant peak he was aiming for. The next, the world was gone, replaced by a churning vertical sea of snow. Disoriented, he'd tried to turn back, but in the whiteout, there was no back. There was only the storm. Diablo, usually rock-steady, had become frantic. A snow-laden branch, heavy as a man, had cracked and fallen, spooking the horse. Diablo had reared, and in the chaos, Lucas's foot had become hopelessly entangled in the rigging as he was thrown. And now this, being dragged through hell. His mind began to drift a flimsy raft on a churning sea of delirium. He saw Elias not dead in the dust, but grinning, sharing a bottle of whiskey by a campfire, the flames reflecting in his bright eyes. He saw Martha Rowe's face, etched with a grief so profound it had hollowed her out. He saw the terrified eyes of Mrs. Gable. They swirled around him in the snow ghosts, judging his failure. "You were too slow, Jed," Elias's voice, a phantom in the wind. "He's gone because of you." Martha's whisper, sharp as an icicle. A sharp, agonizing tear in his shoulder yanked him back to the brutal present. His coat had snagged on a jagged branch, and for a moment the fabric held stretching, groaning. He felt a dislocating pop in his shoulder socket that sent a wave of white-hot agony through his body, eclipsing the cold. Then the fabric ripped free, and the dragging resumed. His head struck something hard. A rock. The world exploded into a silent flash of light, then faded to a pinprick. The roaring of the wind receded, becoming a distant hum. The violent motion slowed, then stopped. He was dimly aware that Diablo, exhausted and freezing, had finally come to a halt, his great body shuddering against the onslaught of the wind. Darkness profound and absolute began to claim him. This was it, then. The end of the trail. Silas Kane had won. He'd not only taken Elias's life, but he'd lured Lucas to his own pathetic, lonely death, a fittingly grim end for a failed lawman. His last coherent thought was one of bitter irony. He had spent a year hunting a ghost, only to become one himself, a frozen footnote in an anonymous snowdrift. But then, through the closing curtain of his consciousness, he saw it. A light. It was faint, impossibly distant. A tiny, warm smudge of orange against the oppressive, swirling grey. It wavered, almost vanished, then returned, a single defiant spark in the abyss. A candle in a window. A lantern. It was life. The sight or the illusion of it triggered a final primal spark of will within him. He could not move, could not speak. But in the depths of his soul, a voice he hadn't heard in a year. The voice of Marshal Lucas Stone. The man who never gave up, cried out. It was a silent, desperate prayer to a god he no longer believed in, a plea sent toward that tiny, impossible light. And then nothing. The darkness took him completely. The fire was Clara Vance's universe. It lived in the stone hearth that dominated the small one-room cabin, a living, breathing creature of orange and red. It was her clock, its consumption of the precious, dwindling woodpile, marking the passage of terrifyingly slow hours. It was her companion, its crackles and pops, a conversation against the shrieking monologue of the blizzard outside. It was her hope, the sole barrier between the life growing within her and the frozen death that clawed at the log walls. Her hand rested instinctively on the pronounced swell of her belly. The baby was quiet today, a stark contrast to the vigorous kicking and turning of the past week. The stillness worried her more than the storm. 9 days. 9 days since her husband Thomas had ridden out towards the small mining supply town of Silver Creek. It should have been a 2-day trip, 3 at most. Just getting a few last things before the baby comes, Clara. He had said, his gentle blue eyes full of love and a touch of anxiety. More salt, some flannel for the cradle I'm making. I'll be back before you can miss me. She missed him. She missed him with an ache so profound, it felt like a physical part of her. Thomas was her rock, a kind, steady man who had seen past her quiet nature and into her heart. They had built this cabin with their own hands, a testament to their dream of a life far from the smog and noise of the eastern cities he'd described. Here he'd said they would be masters of their own destiny. But out here, destiny was a cruel and capricious thing, and its master was the weather. The blizzard had hit on the 3rd day he was gone, the day he should have been riding home. It had come without warning, a white wall that had swallowed the world. For the first 2 days, she'd held on to hope, telling herself that Thomas, a practical and experienced frontiersman, would have found shelter in town or holed up in a trapper's lean-to. But as the days bled into one another, measured only by the height of the snowdrifts that now climbed past the windowsill, hope began to curdle into a cold, hard dread. The cabin, once a cozy haven, had become a prison. The wind found every chink in the log walls, sending tiny, probing drafts of icy air across the floor. The world outside the single grime-streaked window was a featureless, moving wall of white. It was like being at the bottom of a churning ocean of milk. Her resources were a litany of fear she recited daily. The woodpile, stacked high by Thomas, was now a pathetic mound in the corner, maybe enough for 2 more days if she was frugal. The flour was low, the salted pork nearly gone. The water was the most pressing problem. The creek was 100 yards away, but in this blizzard it might as well be 100 miles. She'd been forced to melt snow, a laborious process that yielded little and seemed to invite the cold directly into her home. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. This was a different sound, a rhythmic, desperate thrashing just beyond the door. It was followed by a heavy, animalistic groan of exhaustion. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. A wolf. A bear driven mad by the storm. The rifle, Thomas's prized Winchester, was mounted above the hearth. She was a decent shot at targets, but at a living, desperate creature. She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the thick wood, listening. The thrashing had stopped, but she could hear the ragged, heaving breaths of a large animal. Peering through a tiny crack in the shuttered window, she saw a shape, a dark mass against the white. A horse. Steam billowed from its nostrils. It stood head bowed, shuddering, a statue of misery. And then she saw what was behind it. A shape, A man, or what was left of one half buried in the snow, a dark line trailing away from him into the whiteout. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He was being dragged. His foot was caught. Her first instinct was a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. A stranger. In this wilderness, a stranger was more often a threat than a godsend. He could be an outlaw, a madman, injured and dangerous as a cornered animal. Helping him could mean inviting her own death into her home. Her duty was to the child inside her. Survive. That was the only imperative. She could leave him. No one would ever know. The storm would cover all tracks, all evidence of her choice. By morning, he would be just another frozen mound, his story erased by the snow. It was the safe choice, the logical choice. She looked at the fire, her little universe of warmth. It was finite. A man, especially a wounded man, would require constant heat. He would consume her precious wood at a terrifying rate. He would consume her food. He would consume her chances. Then she looked back out the window. The horse Diablo hadn't bolted. It stood guard over the fallen man, its loyalty a silent, powerful testament. And the man, he wasn't moving. At all. He was at the mercy of the elements, a breath away from the end. She thought of Thomas, lost somewhere, out in that same white hell. What if he were lying like that, near dead, outside a stranger's cabin? Would they take him in? Would they risk their fire for him? The question shamed her. The baby inside her gave a sudden, powerful kick, as if in agreement. This was not a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between who she was and who she was afraid of becoming. Thomas had married a strong, compassionate woman, not a coward who would let a man perish on her doorstep. Damn it all to hell, she whispered the words, a prayer of resolve. The next hour was a blur of brutal, desperate effort. Pulling on Thomas's heavy, bearskin coat, she plunged into the storm. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath and burning her lungs. The wind tore at her, trying to throw her off balance. She waded through snow that was waist-deep in places, the effort making her grunt and strain. Reaching the horse, she spoke to it in low, soothing tones. It shied away, its eyes wide with panic, but it was too exhausted to fight. The man was a dead weight, his face a mask of frozen blood and snow. For a moment, she thought he was already gone. But when she placed her trembling fingers on his neck, she felt it a pulse, faint and thready. But there, he was alive. Freeing his foot was a nightmare. The leather of his boot was frozen stiff, the ropes knotted and iced over. Her fingers, even in thick mittens, quickly grew numb. She had to go back to the cabin for a skinning knife, her mind screaming at the time she was losing, at the precious heat escaping her open door. Finally, with a last desperate saw and a pull that sent a jolt of pain through her own strained back, the boot came free. Now the real test began. He was a big man, solid muscle and bone. Dragging him the 50 feet to the cabin was the most physically demanding thing Clara had ever done. She pulled, she slipped, she fell to her knees, sobbing with frustration and effort. She wrapped his arms around her shoulders and heaved her pregnant belly, a constant awkward impediment. Each foot gained was a victory. The wind howled its disapproval, trying to steal him back, but she would not let it. She got him inside, collapsing onto the floorboards next to him, her body screaming in protest. She slammed the door shut, locking out the storm, and for a moment there was only the sound of the fire. her own ragged gasps, and the terrifyingly shallow breathing of the stranger. She stripped off his frozen, blood-soaked outer layers, with the knife cutting away the ruined coat and shirt. His torso was a canvas of angry purple and black bruises. His left shoulder was clearly dislocated, sitting at a sickening angle. A long, shallow gash ran across his temple. Working with a desperate urgency, she cleaned his wounds with warm water and whiskey from Thomas's private bottle, the sharp smell filling the cabin. She found an old medical book her mother had given her, its pages on dislocations, terrifyingly brief. Following the crude diagrams, she gritted her teeth, placed her foot in his armpit for leverage, and pulled. The sickening wet pop as the joint slid back into place made her gag, but the man's breathing seemed to deepen slightly. She wrapped his ribs tightly with torn strips of flannel, packed his head wound with a poultice of yarrow she'd dried in the summer, and covered him with every spare blanket she owned. She maneuvered him closer to the hearth, as close as she dared, without risking a spark. Then she fed the fire. She looked at her wood pile, then at the man. She took 3 logs, more than she would have used in an entire day, and placed them on the flames. The fire roared to life, a greedy, hungry beast. But it was a beast that was keeping 2 people alive now. Or 3. She collapsed into her rocking chair, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The stranger was a dark, still shape under the blankets. His fate was now tied to hers, his life dependent on her dwindling pile of wood. She had risked her fire. She had risked everything. She didn't know if she had saved a good man or a devil. She didn't even know his name. All she knew was that in the heart of the great white wilderness, she was no longer alone. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. For 2 days, the man was a ghost haunting her cabin. He drifted in and out of consciousness, a vessel of fever and pain. Clara's life settled into a grim, exhausting routine. Tend the fire, melt snow, check the man, tend the fire, listen to the storm. Check the man. The world shrank to the dimensions of the log walls, the universe to the flickering light of the hearth. She learned the rhythms of his delirium. He would thrash and mutter his words, a broken mosaic of his life. He spoke of dust and heat, of a man named Elias. His voice thick with a grief so raw, it made Clara's own sorrow for Thomas feel less lonely. He spoke of a promise to a woman named Martha. He spoke of a star, a silver star he'd lost. And he spoke a name that made the blood freeze in her veins. Cain. He'd groaned on the second night, his eyes squeezed shut, his body rigid. Silas Cain. Vulture. Trinidad. Clara froze the ladle of broth in her hand, trembling. Silas Cain. It wasn't a common name, and she had heard it before. Just 2 weeks ago, a traveling fur trapper, old Lucas's namesake, ironically had stopped at their cabin for a night sharing news from the wider world. He'd spoken of a gang of cutthroats led by a man of particular sadism, Silas Cain, who were rumored to be moving north, seeking fresh territory after making the Texas border too hot for themselves. They ain't common road agents, Thomas the trapper had warned, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. They hit a freight wagon near Pueblo, killed the drivers and the guards. Not for the payroll, mind you. They stole the whole wagon, full of blasting powder rifles and ammunition. Headed for the mining camps, they reckon. A man like that can start his own private army with a haul like that. A freight wagon, full of blasting powder and rifles. Thomas had been heading to Silver Creek for supplies. Supplies that would have arrived on a freight wagon. A cold dread far more chilling than the blizzard began to seep into Clara's heart. The timing was too close, the location too plausible. She looked at the stranger, now quiet again, his face pale in the firelight. He wasn't a random drifter. He was hunting the very man who might have been responsible for her husband's disappearance. Her act of charity had brought the larger, violent world crashing into her isolated sanctuary. On the third day, the fever broke. The man's eyes opened, and for the first time they were clear. They were a startlingly deep shade of blue, weary and haunted, but lucid. He blinked slowly, taking in the log ceiling, the stone hearth, the woman in the rocking chair watching him. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "My cabin," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the fluttering in her chest. "You were caught in the storm. Your horse brought you here." He tried to sit up, a sharp intake of breath and a grimace of pain stopping him. "My horse? Diablo. He's in the lean-to. I've been giving him what hay I have." She paused. "You've been here for 3 days. He absorbed this, his gaze sweeping over his bandaged chest and the blankets covering him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the dark circles under her eyes, and the defiant strength in her jaw. He also saw quite clearly that she was heavily pregnant. A wave of shame washed over him. This woman, alone and vulnerable, had saved him. She had expended her strength, her resources, on a complete stranger. "My name is Lucas Stone," he said, his voice a little stronger. I owe you my life." "You owe me a cord of firewood," Clara replied, her tone clipped and practical, betraying none of the turmoil within her. "My name is Clara Vance." A tense silence settled between them, punctuated by the howl of the wind. They were two strangers, bound by circumstance, each holding back a flood of questions. Lucas wanted to know where he was, how bad the storm was. Clara wanted to scream the name she'd heard him speak, to demand answers he might not have. She broke the silence first, her voice carefully neutral. "You were delirious. You spoke of a man. Silas Kane." Lucas's eyes narrowed. The weariness was replaced by a hard, dangerous light. It was the look of the lawman he used to be. "What do you know of him?" "My husband, Thomas, went to Silver Creek for supplies 10 days ago." She said, her words measured each one a heavy stone. "He was due back before the storm. A trapper told us a gang, led by a man named Kane, had hit a freight wagon on that route. Stole munitions." The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with unspoken understanding. Lucas saw the fear and dawning grief in her eyes, and he understood. Her husband hadn't just been delayed by the snow. "I was tracking him," Lucas said softly, his voice laced with a guilt that felt like acid. "Kane. That's how I got caught in this damn storm. I was pushing too hard." He looked away from her towards the fire. His reckless pursuit, his all-consuming need for vengeance, had not only led to his own downfall, but had brought this terrible news to the door of the woman who had saved him. He was a harbinger of doom. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, the words inadequate. "Is there any chance," she whispered, her voice finally breaking the carefully constructed wall of composure crumbling, "that my Thomas, that he just found shelter?" Lucas thought of Silas Kane. He thought of the stories he'd heard, the bodies he'd seen. Kane didn't leave witnesses. He didn't allow for loose ends. But he couldn't say that to this woman. He couldn't be the one to extinguish that final flickering ember of hope. "There's always a chance," he lied. And in that moment something shifted between them. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim. They were allies, however unwitting. They were two people whose lives had been poisoned by the same man. A fragile, unspoken pact was forged in the firelight of that isolated cabin. They would survive this storm, and then, somehow, they would face the ghost that haunted them both. Over the next 2 days, as Lucas slowly regained his strength, a strange domesticity took hold. He was still too weak to do much, but he could sit up and feed the fire, taking that burden from Clara. They spoke little of Cain or Thomas, the subjects too raw, too painful. Instead, they talked of small things. He told her about his horse Diablo and the bayous of his childhood. She told him about the garden she planned to plant in the spring, listing the vegetables as if naming them could will the snow away. It was a delicate truce with reality, a shared fiction they both desperately needed. But with every log Lucas placed on the fire, he was acutely aware that he was burning through her future. The woodpile was now barely a scattering of logs and kindling. The storm showed no signs of abating. The hope he had offered her was a lie, and the safety she had given him was running out. They were trapped not just by the snow, but by the dwindling resources that separated them from freezing. The ghost of Silas Cain had led them here, and the spectre of starvation was settling in to watch. On the 7th day of Lucas's presence in the cabin, the wind finally died. The silence that descended was unnerving, more profound and ominous than the storm's roar. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a world buried alive. Snow was piled in monstrous drifts against the door and had completely covered the window, plunging the cabin into a perpetual fire-lit twilight. The wood was all but gone. A few splintered logs remained a pathetic defense against the biting cold that was already creeping back into the corners of the room. The last of the salted pork had been eaten the night before. Hope was a currency they could no longer afford. "I can try and clear the door," Lucas said, his voice still raspy. He could stand now, though. His ribs screamed in protest with every breath. "There's a stand of deadfall pine about a 1/4 mile east of here. I can bring some back. You'll never make it through that snow," Clara stated, not as a challenge, but as a fact. "It'll be over your head. And your shoulder." "We don't have a choice," he countered, his jaw set. Before the argument could continue, a new sound broke the silence. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heavy, muffled sound from outside. Not the wind, not an animal. It was the sound of someone or something hitting the cabin door. They both froze, eyes locked across the small room. Every horror story of the frontier, every tale of desperate outlaws and starving men flashed through their minds. Thump, thump, crack. A splinter of wood on the door frame gave way. A voice coarse and raw from the cold yelled from outside. "Hello, the cabin. Anybody in there? We're freezing out here. Need shelter." Lucas grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, his body instantly tensing. He moved to the side of the door, pressing himself against the wall, his face a mask of grim readiness. All the instincts of the lawman he once was came flooding back. Clara's face was ashen. She looked from Lucas to the door, her hand protectively on her belly. "Who is it?" Lucas called out, his voice low and commanding. There was a moment's pause, then a different voice answered, smoother, almost charming, yet with a chilling lack of warmth. "Just a couple of travelers, friend, caught in this devil's own blizzard. Our horses gave out. We saw your chimney smoke. We'd be eternally grateful for a spot by your fire. We have silver to pay." Lucas's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He had heard it in his nightmares for a year. It was smoother now, not raised in anger as it had been in Trinidad, but it was unmistakable. It was the silken, venomous cadence of Silas Kane. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide, with a silent, frantic warning. He put a finger to his lips. Clara, seeing the look on his face, understood immediately. Her fear turned into a cold, sharp terror that was almost paralyzing. The monster from her husband's story, the ghost from Lucas's past, was on her doorstep. "The door is drifted over," Lucas shouted, playing for time, his mind racing. "Can't open it. Then we'll be happy to dig it out for you." The charming voice replied, followed by the muffled sound of men beginning to scrape and dig at the snow. They were trapped. There was no escape. Running was impossible. A firefight was suicide. Lucas was Zuhoratooth, and they were outnumbered. Their only chance was deception. "Listen to me," Lucas whispered to Clara, his voice urgent and low. "My name is John. John Smith. I'm your cousin helping you while your husband is away. I got caught here by the storm. No matter what happens, I am not Lucas Stone. We do not know Silas Kane. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, her eyes wide with terror, but her jaw set with a new, fierce resolve. The abstract grief for her husband had just been given a face, and it was on the other side of her door. "They will kill us if they find out who I am." Lucas added, his meaning clear. "And they will kill us for sport if they think we're a liability." The digging outside was getting louder, more frantic. Soon the door would be clear. The rifle, Clara whispered, nodding towards the Winchester above the hearth. "One rifle against two, maybe more." "And he's got me pinned in here," Lucas reasoned. "No. We play dumb. We are simple folk. We are not a threat. It's the only way." Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the pressure against the door lessened. It creaked open a few inches. A man's face appeared in the crack, bearded, grimy, with small, suspicious eyes. This was the first speaker, the brute. Behind him, another figure pushed his way forward. He was taller, dressed in a fine, though snow-caked, woolen coat. He had a clean-shaven, handsome face, with intelligent, dark eyes that missed nothing. A charismatic smile played on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold and dead like a snake's. It was Silas Kane. "1,000 apologies for the intrusion," Kane said, his smile widening as he took in the scene, the pregnant woman, the injured man by the fire. His gaze lingered on Clara's belly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "My associate Gabe and I are deeply in your debt." He stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. Gabe followed, closing the door behind them and blocking their only exit. The small cabin suddenly felt claustrophobically crowded. "My name is Silas," he said, extending a hand that Lucas pointedly ignored. "And you are John Smith." Lucas grunted, leaning heavily on the poker as if it were a cane. "This is my cousin Clara Vance. Her husband is away." "A pleasure," Mrs. Vance, Kane said, giving her a slight, courtly bow. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the meager supplies, the nearly empty wood pile, the blankets piled on the floor, where Lucas had been sleeping. "Tough spot you're in here. We seem to have arrived at the end of the party." He gestured to the last few logs by the fire. "We've managed," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "So I see," Kane said, his gaze falling on Lucas's bandaged ribs and the healing gash on his temple. "Looks like you had a bit of trouble yourself, John." "Horse fell," Lucas muttered, not meeting his eye. "Busted some ribs." Kane and Gabe exchanged a look. They stripped off their heavy coats, revealing the Colt revolvers holstered at their hips. They were confident masters of the situation. They sat down at the small wooden table, assuming the role of guests, but the threat they posed was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating as smoke. The drama had entered its most dangerous act. Lucas, the former lawman, was forced to play the part of a helpless farmer. Clara, a grieving wife, had to act as a gracious host to the man she believed had murdered her husband. And Silas Kane, a predator, sensing weakness, sat between them. His charming smile, a mask for the violence, coiled just beneath the surface. And in the corner, the last few logs of firewood burned down, counting down the time they had left until the cold and the men who brought it with them would claim everything. The fire, once Clara's universe, was now the centerpiece of a deadly stage. Just then, Clara felt a sharp, twisting pain deep in her lower back. She gasped, trying to hide it, but Kane's predatory eyes missed nothing. "Are you all right, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. She forced a smile. Just the baby. Shifting. But it wasn't just a shift. It was the first unmistakable pang of labor. The blizzard had trapped them. A killer was in her house, and her baby was coming. The contraction was a hot, clenching fist inside her. Clara gritted her teeth, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of her rocking chair. She forced her breathing to remain even, focusing on the dancing flames in the hearth, praying that the monster sitting at her table hadn't noticed. But Silas Kane noticed everything. "Childbirth is a treacherous business," Kane said conversationally, pouring himself a cup of water from her dwindling bucket. He took a sip, savoring it like fine wine. "My own mother died bringing me into this world. Some might say it was a poor trade." He chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. Gabe, his brutish companion, smirked. Lucas felt a surge of pure hatred, so potent it was almost a physical force. He had to keep Kane talking, keep him distracted, keep him from seeing the silent panic in Clara's eyes. "You said your horses gave out," Lucas said, his voice a low rumble. "Where were you headed in this mess?" "Business," Kane replied vaguely, his eyes still fixed on Clara. "We were to meet some associates, but this storm, it seems, has a way of changing plans. Tell me, John, this husband of your cousin's, what's his name?" "Thomas," Clara answered before Lucas could invent a lie. Her voice was tight. Another pain, sharper this time, was building. "Thomas Vance," Kane mused, tapping a finger on the table. "I don't suppose he was a freight man, was he? Big fellow, kind. Eyes drove a team of 4 stout mules." Clara's blood turned to ice. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her horror a naked thing on her face. Kane's charming smile returned wider and more terrible than before. "I thought I recognized the name from the wagon's manifest. He was a brave man, your Thomas. Tried to play the hero with an old scattergun. A foolish choice." He sighed dramatically. "My associate, Gabe here, has to be convinced to leave no loose ends." Gabe grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. He squealed good. It was too much. The carefully constructed dam of Clara's composure broke. A low, guttural cry of pure anguish tore from her throat. She doubled over as another, more powerful contraction seized her, this one undeniable. "Ah," Kane said, his eyes lighting up with a cruel scientific curiosity. "And so it begins." In that instant, with Clara's cry of pain and Kane's admission of murder, the charade was over. Lucas moved. He didn't go for the rifle. He didn't lunge. He did the one thing they wouldn't expect. With a guttural roar, he kicked the leg of the small table. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The table tilted, sending their cups of water, and Kane's smug composure spilling to the floor. As Kane and Gabe flinched, Lucas lunged not at them but at the hearth. He grabbed the last unburned log, a solid piece of seasoned oak, and hurled it with all his might, not at the men, but at the single grime-streaked window. Glass exploded outwards into the snowdrift. A blast of frigid, howling air ripped through the cabin, sucking the warmth from the room in a single gasp. The fire in the hearth, starved for oxygen by the sealed cabin, now roared as the draft hit it, flames leaping up the chimney. "What in God's name?" Gabe yelled, reaching for his gun. "He's the law!" Kane screamed. His face contorted in a mask of fury as he finally recognized the burning intensity in Lucas's eyes. "It's Marshall Stone." The name hung in the icy air. Gabe's pistol was already out, leveling at Lucas. But Lucas wasn't there. He had dropped to the floor, rolling behind the meager cover of the rocking chair, grabbing the iron poker as he went. A gunshot boomed, deafening in the small space. The bullet tore through the back of the rocking chair, splintering the wood inches from Lucas's head. "Shoot him, you fool!" Kane shrieked, drawing his own Colt. But Clara, in the midst of her agony, acted. With a scream that was part pain, part rage, she heaved the heavy, waterlogged bucket from beside the hearth. A sloshing wave of icy water flew through the air, dousing the fire. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The roaring fire was extinguished in a hiss of steam and smoke. The cabin was plunged into near total darkness. The only light now the faint grey luminescence from the broken window. Thick, acrid smoke filled the room, choking them, blinding them. Chaos erupted. Gabe fired again, wildly this time, the muzzle flash, a brief, terrifying strobe that illuminated a scene from hell. Kane was shouting, coughing, trying to get his bearings. Lucas knew this was his only chance. He knew the layout of the cabin by heart. They didn't. He scrambled on the floor, the cold seeping into his bones, his ribs a chorus of agony. He could hear Clara's ragged breathing punctuated by pained sobs near the bed in the corner. He had to end this. Now. "I'm over here, Kane," he yelled from the left side of the room, then immediately crab-walked to the right. Another shot flashed in the darkness, chewing up the log wall where his voice had come from. Under the cover of the smoke and confusion, Lucas moved with a lawman's purpose. He knew Gabe was the muscle, Kane the brain. Take out the muscle first. He could hear Gabe's heavy, panicked breathing near the door. Lucas rose to a crouch, the iron poker held like a club. He saw Gabe's silhouette against the faint light of the window, and lunged. He brought the poker down hard on the man's gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a howl of pain. Gabe's revolver clattered to the floor. Lucas didn't hesitate. He drove the pointed end of the poker forward into Gabe's throat. The man made a gurgling sound and collapsed a dead weight. "Gabe!" Kane screamed, his voice laced with panic now. He fired blindly into the smoke. "It's just you and me now, Silas." Lucas rasped his voice, a low promise from the darkness. Like it should have been in Trinidad. "I'll kill you, Stone. I'll kill you and that whore, and her bastard." Kane shrieked, his composure utterly gone. He was backpedaling, moving towards the broken window, towards the only escape. "You'll have to find me first," Lucas said, his voice coming from near the hearth now. But it was a feint. As Kane spun and fired towards the sound, Lucas tackled him from the side, a brutal full-body collision driven by a year of rage and guilt. His injured shoulder screamed, but he ignored it. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs in the freezing darkness. Kane was wiry and strong, fighting like a cornered rat. His thumbs went for Lucas's eyes. Lucas twisted away, slamming Kane's head against the hard, packed dirt floor. Kane's pistol was trapped between them. They grappled for it, a desperate, silent struggle for control. Lucas's fingers found the trigger guard. Kane's hand was on the cylinder, preventing it from turning. Lucas used his weight, driving his good shoulder down, using the pain in his ribs as fuel. With a final desperate heave, he broke Kane's grip. He pressed the barrel of the Colt under Silas Kane's chin. The fight went out of the outlaw instantly. In the gloom, Lucas could see the whites of his eyes. "You should have left a witness, Silas." Lucas breathed his words, frosting in the frigid air. From the corner of the room, a new sound cut through the tension. It was not a sound of pain or fear, but of life. A thin, reedy cry. A baby's first cry. In the midst of death and darkness, life had arrived. The sound seemed to break the spell. Lucas looked over into the gloom towards Clara. The hatred in his heart, the burning need for vengeance, suddenly felt like a hollow, useless thing. Killing Kane now wouldn't bring back Elias. It wouldn't undo Thomas's murder. It would just be another death in a room that had seen enough. He dragged Kane to his feet. "It's over." With a sudden, violent shove, he pushed Silas Kane out through the broken window, sending him stumbling and falling into the deep snowdrift outside. "Go," Lucas commanded, his voice raw with exhaustion. "Tell them what happened here. Tell them Marshal Stone let you live. Let that be your prison. Knowing I could have, and I didn't." Kane, scrambling to his feet, stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and hatred. Then, without a word, he turned and floundered away into the grey, frozen landscape, a defeated man swallowed by the wilderness. Lucas barred the door, then slowly, painfully made his way to the bed. Clara was slumped against the headboard, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in a flannel sheet. He knelt beside the bed, the iron poker falling from his numb fingers. The tiny cabin was freezing, filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland. But inside, in this small, sacred space, a new life had begun. Clara looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but also a strength he had never seen before. "It's a boy," she whispered. Lucas looked at the child, at his tiny, perfect hands. He thought of Elias, of Thomas, of all the ghosts that had driven him here. This wasn't the ending he had sought. Vengeance had slipped through his fingers. But as he looked at the mother and child, bathed in the faint light of a new day, filtering through the broken window, he realized it was the beginning he needed. The storm had broken. Outside, the sun was beginning to pierce the clouds, glinting off a world of pristine white snow. The fire was out, but in the heart of the cabin, a new, more resilient flame had been lit. In the end, it wasn't a bullet that brought down the vulture of the Rio Grande, but a choice. Lucas Stone's quest for vengeance ended not with a body in the snow, but with a life in his hands. He and Clara Vance, along with her newborn son, whom she named Thomas, survived. When the thaw came, they left that small cabin behind, but they carried its lessons with them. Legend says Silas Kane was found months later half mad from starvation and frostbite, his reputation shattered by the story of the marshal who showed him mercy. Lucas never wore a star again. He didn't need to. He found his redemption not in bringing a man to justice, but in helping a family find a future. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, in the face of unspeakable evil, the most courageous act is not to take a life, but to protect one. If this story of resilient sacrifice and the birth of hope in the darkest of times moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates tales of the untamed frontier. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the heart of the Wild West. What do you think was Lucas's true justice? Let us know in the comments below.